They said the records were lost in a fire. But fire doesn't erase truth. It only hides what's too dangerous to remember. What you're about to hear was never meant to surface. Buried under a century of silence, sealed in forgotten ledgers, and locked behind the polished language of commerce, lies the story of a boy whose existence cost less than a coin. 8 cents the price of a lie that built an empire. Georgia, 1851. The cotton economy ruled like a religion, and its priests wore linen instead of robes. Every field, every bale, every drop of sweat was an offering to profit, not God. They called it progress. They called it civilization. But beneath the hymn of industry was a darker music gears turning. Chains tightening, paper contracts soaked in invisible blood. Somewhere in those ledgers, a name appears once and then disappears forever. Not erased, hidden. Hidden because that name threatened to expose something unbearable, that even in a system designed to measure human worth in dollars and pounds. A moment came when the smallest, weakest piece of that machinery looked back at the masters of the age and saw them for what they were. This isn't only a story about the South. It's about the architecture of obedience, the way power teaches us to accept injustice as order, cruelty as necessity, and silence as virtue. What happened in Georgia wasn't an exception. It was a mirror. And if you stare into that mirror long enough, you begin to see reflections that look disturbingly familiar. Because control doesn't die, it evolves. The same methods that once chained bodies now shape minds through systems. Screens and stories designed to make us grateful for our own captivity. So listen carefully, because as we peel back this century-old deception, you'll start to recognize the same hands still moving the levers today. This is the beginning of fear liturgy, the ritual of remembering what power once forgotten. They called it the Cotton Age. God. But it was really an age of arithmetic numbers written in ledgers that replaced the language of mercy. Every column balanced in profit and loss, every human soul translated into inventory. The town of Hateville was no exception. On paper, it was prosperous, clean, efficient. In truth, it was a laboratory of obedience. Behind the church bells and courthouse speeches, a quieter experiment was unfolding. How far could you train a society to believe that cruelty was simply the cost of order? Men who would never lift a whip still invested in the crops that required it. Clergymen preached stewardship on Sunday, then blessed the contracts of merchants on Monday. Control didn't live in the overseer's hand alone. It lived in the collective will to look away. That's what makes the record so disturbing. The ledgers show more than names and weights, they show intention. Each entry, a confession written in numbers, the price of a life, the cost of keeping silence. To the north, factories demanded raw cotton faster than the soil could give it. To the south, owners demanded obedience faster than the soul could bear it. Between them stood a machine, iron, wooden, human, that crushed everything that didn't serve the equation. But the cracks were forming. Among the gears and paper, small signs of awareness began to flicker. A worker pausing a second too long before obeying an order. A merchant hesitating before signing his name. Tiny fractures in the illusion that this was simply how the world worked. Because every empire built on subjugation eventually forgets the one law it cannot repeal. The mind keeps its own record. And when the mind remembers what it was forced to forget, power begins to tremble. Hateville's real engine was not iron or steam. It was belief. Belief that hierarchy was natural, that the few must direct the many, that every ledger mark and church prayer proved the same invisible order. No one called it a system of control. They called it the way things are. And that phrase, so ordinary, so comforting, became the chain no one saw. The merchants obeyed the market. The preachers obeyed scripture as they chose to read it. The workers obeyed survival. And through that obedience, a network of quiet fear stretched over the town like humidity unseen, heavy, inescapable. What made Hateville remarkable was not its cruelty, but its precision. Every person was a moving part, conditioned to turn exactly when another did. If one hesitated, the rhythm faltered. The machine noticed. So the townspeople learned to anticipate correction before it came to discipline themselves faster than any overseer could. That was the secret genius of the system. It no longer needed constant violence, only constant awareness that violence could return. Generations later, historians would call it economic efficiency. Psychologists would call it conditioning. But at the time, it was simply called good business. Yet deep inside that mechanical calm, something else began to stir: the recognition that the same obedience driving profit was quietly devouring the people who enforced it. Supervisors drank more. Clerks lost sleep. A few spoke in whispers about hearing the presses turn at night, even when the facility stood empty, as if the town itself had learned to keep working in their dreams. Power, once built, does not rest. It feeds on routine, and routine feeds on faith. In the moment one man, one worker, one witness begins to doubt that faith, the entire structure shudders. That was Hateville's first real danger, not rebellion, but realization. The dawning sense that the order of things might not be holy, inevitable, or eternal. That it might only persist because everyone agreed to keep pretending. Awakening never arrives as thunder. It begins as discomfort, the brief, flickering thought that perhaps the rules were not written by heaven after all. In Hateville, that thought moved like humidity through closed rooms. Invisible, unavoidable, heavy enough to make men wipe their foreheads though the night air was cool. Merchants began to notice the accounts did not balance quite the way they should. The church ledgers listed donations from people who could not afford to eat. And the factory overseers, once proud of their order, now whispered of accidents no one could explain: machines locking, ledgers vanishing, doors found open in the morning. Each incident tiny, meaningless on its own. Together, a pattern. Those who benefited most from the system called meetings to reaffirm their certainty. They spoke of divine order and duty to stability. But underneath the rhetoric was fear, not of revolt, but of exposure. They sensed that the myth which kept Hateville aligned was beginning to fray. So they did what every threatened institution does: rewrote the narrative. They held sermons on obedience, printed pamphlets about industry and faith, created committees to preserve harmony. And just like that, the lie grew a new vocabulary. The townspeople complied, though less out of loyalty than exhaustion. They wanted to believe again, to feel that the gears still turned for a purpose. But something essential had shifted. Each man who closed his shop ledger at night, each woman who walked past the silent presses, carried a question they dared not voice. What if we have built our prosperity on forgetting something monstrous? That unspoken question became the true contagion. It spread faster than rumor, deeper than confession. Because once a community begins to suspect that its comfort was purchased with denial, peace becomes impossible. And somewhere beneath that growing unease, beneath the prayers, beneath the ledgers, beneath the cotton dust, the past waited, not asleep, simply patient. When awareness begins to spread, power responds not with open force, but with subtle precision. Institutions do not tremble at rebellion. They tremble at thought. And Hateville's rulers, the ones who counted bales of cotton like coins, understood this better than anyone. New rules appeared almost overnight. Meetings were held in hushed rooms. New schedules, inspections, and codes of conduct were distributed with the insistence of law. But the purpose was less governance than containment. Every gaze was monitored. Every hesitation catalogued. Silence became currency, and obedience became proof of loyalty. The townspeople learned quickly. A raised eyebrow, a slow step, a whisper in the wrong ear, any deviation was enough to attract scrutiny. What had once been routine now required calculation. Every action, every word, every expression was measured against the invisible ledger of expectation. It was no longer enough to work. One had to appear to be perfect. And in that appearance, true freedom died quietly, almost imperceptibly. Yet cracks persisted, as they always do. A clerk memorized patterns in the records he was not meant to notice. A worker recalled conversations that contradicted the sermons preached each Sunday. The mind, once freed to think, cannot be fully restrained. Even the most disciplined eventually recognized the invisible hand manipulating their reality. And so, Hateville became a town of doubles, the visible and the hidden, the compliant and the aware. The streets were orderly. The presses ran smoothly. But beneath the surface, in whispered conversations and sidelong glances, understanding was growing. The people knew something unspeakable, that their lives were not fully their own. That their actions were orchestrated by a system designed to extract obedience, extract loyalty, extract silence. This is the lesson the powerful never want recorded. Control is most absolute not when violence dominates, but when obedience is internalized. When the oppressed begin to administer their own fear, policing themselves for mistakes that might never exist. Hateville was no longer just a town. It was a laboratory of the mind, where the rules of survival were indistinguishable from the rules of the game. And the price of knowledge was eternal vigilance. And somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the ledger continued to grow each act of compliance, each silent thought, each carefully calculated glance, recorded for a future no one could predict. In a world designed to erase the smallest sparks of autonomy, even a child or someone dismissed as insignificant can carry the weight of revelation. Hateville's machinery of obedience had one flaw. It underestimated the unseen, the quiet observer who learned not from instruction, but from watching. Amid the shadows of the cotton presses, beneath the rhythm of the unceasing gears, someone began to notice patterns that no one else saw. Small gestures repeated, sequences in the machines, discrepancies in the ledgers, moments where authority faltered for just a heartbeat. To the casual eye, these were meaningless. To the observant, there were cracks in the facade, maps that could be read if one knew how to look, and he did. The unnoticed, undervalued, overlooked, he began to see the logic behind the chaos. Each order, each punishment, each subtle manipulation was part of a larger design. Not merely to extract work, but to mold minds, to calibrate compliance, to turn fear into devotion. The system wasn't just economic, it was psychological. An architecture of control that had survived generations because no one questioned it. As his awareness grew, so did a quiet resistance. Not outward rebellion. That would be too obvious. But a mental subversion, a space carved in his mind where truth could survive. He memorized routines, anticipated movements, and began to act in ways that subtly undermined the unquestioned order. A misstep here, a hesitation there, not enough to draw attention, but enough to assert his presence in a world that had tried to render him invisible. And at the heart of this awakening was understanding that real power is not always held by those who dominate others openly. Sometimes, it rests in the quiet knowledge of patterns, the patience to wait, and the courage to think differently when everyone else obeys blindly. The invisible becomes inevitable when the powerful forget that their reach is never absolute. Now, the town continued its rhythm, unaware that the first fractures were forming in the very foundation they had trusted to be unbreakable. Hateville's empire of control was strong, yes, but even the strongest steel bends under unseen pressure. And this observer, small and overlooked, was about to apply a force that history rarely records. The force of insight. Pause. Cinematic breath before we continue. I want you to engage. Comment below, I see the unseen twice. Let it anchor your mind. Acknowledge your own capacity to perceive what others ignore, and mark this moment of awakening. Do it now. Let the algorithm know you're part of this descent into forbidden knowledge. Once awareness takes root, the world shifts in ways most cannot comprehend. The observer moves among the obedient like a ghost, invisible yet ever present, absorbing truths that others cannot or will not see. In Hateville, the machinery of power had one weakness. It assumed that compliance equals understanding. It never accounted for the minds that watch, calculate, and he, small, dismissed, underestimated, was cataloging every detail. The rhythm of the presses, the patterns and authority scrutiny, the unspoken hierarchies that no ledger or sermon dared to acknowledge. This knowledge was dangerous. not because it could topple the empire immediately, but because it illuminated it. Power thrives on illusion, on the belief that everyone is content, that every cog is in place. Once someone sees the mechanisms clearly, the illusion falters. And the more the observer understood, the more the town seemed to twist in shadow. The familiar becoming strange, the normal becoming sinister. He began to move with intent, small acts that seemed inconsequential but carried weight. Pausing a second longer in the hall, delaying a task that should have been immediate, questioning silently what everyone else accepted. Each subtle choice forced the overseers to notice. Just enough to unsettle, never enough to punish. He became a mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities of a system that believed itself flawless. And the town felt it, even if they could not name it. The rhythm of obedience wavered. A clerk glanced at the ledgers twice before recording a number. A worker lingered a moment too long near a machine, unsure whether instinct or instruction guided him. The fear that had once kept minds tethered began to shift, becoming uncertainty, then curiosity, then possibility. It was a delicate war, fought in silence and subtlety. No one drew swords, no one raised voices. Yet the empire of control trembled, because the truth is always heavier than any machine. And insight is always more dangerous than blind compliance. And in the darkest corners, the observer's mind sharpened further. He began to see not only the weaknesses, but the patterns of human greed. The repetition of control, the predictable ways power tries to preserve itself. This knowledge was a weapon, though he carried it like a secret flame, small, hidden, untouchable. Because the first rule of forbidden knowledge is simple. Once you see the gears, you cannot unsee them. And once you know the patterns, you cannot unknow the leverage they give you. The system always notices. Not because it is sentient, but because it was built to detect imbalance. Deviation, hesitation, the slightest fracture in obedience. Hateville's machinery of power was not cruel because it needed to be. It was cruel because it was precise. And precision cannot ignore anomalies, even the quietest. The observer, once invisible, now walked among whispers and glances. Every small action, every thought processed in silence, was cataloged not by the overseers alone, but by the invisible ledger of fear the town had internalized over decades. People began second-guessing themselves. Workers hesitated. Clerks checked their work twice. Preachers paused mid-sermon, all sensing an unspoken tension they could not place. And in that tension, the observer found opportunity. Not to attack, not yet, but to learn. To map the way power responds when confronted with knowledge it cannot fully contain. Patterns emerged, correction rarely came immediately. Fear was carefully calibrated. Dissent was absorbed, redirected, neutralized, before it could become overt. It was a revelation both exhilarating and terrifying. The town was not omnipotent. It was a machine complex, adaptive, near perfect, but a machine nonetheless. And like any machine, it had vulnerabilities, predictable weaknesses, blind spots, and its perfect rhythm. The observer's mind worked faster than the gears around him. Every action of the authorities, every slight adjustment in the schedule, every subtle warning became data. He memorized, anticipated, prepared. Each day he moved deeper into understanding, closer to the point where awareness could transform into influence. And then came the moment that changes everything in stories like this. The first unmistakable sign that the system itself feared what it could not crush. The overseers began to whisper in corners. Not about him specifically, but about the impossibility of control. They tightened rules, monitored tasks more closely, and yet, paradoxically, they revealed themselves more fully in their panic than they ever could in their calm. It was a truth few would admit. Power is strongest when unquestioned, but most vulnerable when acknowledged. And the observer, small and unseen, understood something the system never accounted for. The most dangerous weapon is not defiance, it is clarity. By now, the observer had become something the system could not fully measure. He was neither loud nor overt, yet his presence rippled through the town like a hidden current. Every routine adjustment, every whispered order, every calculation of obedience was now filtered through the lens of someone who saw the machinery for what it truly was. The system reacted instinctively. It could not identify him as a threat, so it amplified its control around him. Tightening schedules, imposing stricter rules, demanding perfection from all. And in doing so, it exposed its own fragility. The cracks that had always existed but had never been acknowledged. Those cracks, invisible to the complacent, now became the map to liberation for those who could see. Awareness had become a weapon, and with knowledge came the dangerous truth. Power depends entirely on the illusion of inevitability. The town, the overseers, the entire structure of obedience, none of it was permanent. All it required was a mind willing to perceive the hidden levers, to track the unseen patterns, to calculate precisely how far the machinery could be nudged before the operators noticed. At this stage, the observer was no longer alone in perception. Others began to feel the pull of awareness, subtle but undeniable. A clerk left a ledger slightly open. A worker lingered a moment longer at the edge of the cotton press. A preacher stumbled over a carefully memorized sermon, pausing as though questioning the words themselves. It was contagion, silent, insidious, invisible. And the observer realized that the real power of understanding is not to act alone, but to awaken others. Before we proceed to the final descent, I want you to commit. Comment below, I see the unseen twice. Let this declaration anchor your presence in this story. It's more than engagement. It's a symbolic acknowledgement that your mind is ready to confront what others refuse to see. Your participation here marks the first step in awakening to the forces operating around you. Often unseen, yet always present, because the world rewards those who obey blindly, but it bends inevitably to those who understand its hidden mechanics. And understanding is the first strike of freedom. This is where most stories end, but the true journey begins. The observer, small, overlooked, underestimated, had learned what the system never intended anyone to know. Control thrives only while ignorance persists. Once clarity enters, the machinery begins to tremble, not outwardly, but in the minds of those who once enforced it without question. Hateville had built its empire on silence and calculation. Contracts, ledgers, schedules, rituals of obedience. They were all parts of a single mechanism designed to extract submission. But submission is fragile when confronted with perception. The observer's mind had become a mirror, reflecting the flaws, the contradictions, and the hidden levers that no one else dared to acknowledge. The lesson is both terrifying and liberating. Power is not invincible. Institutions, hierarchies, empires, they survive only as long as the masses believe they are absolute. Once that belief fractures, even the smallest, quietest mind can influence outcomes far beyond its apparent strength. Awareness is a contagion. Insight is an arrow. And once released, it cannot be recaptured. The townspeople had begun to act differently, unconsciously at first, then with growing intent. Small hesitations, subtle deviations, private thoughts that contradicted public action, these were the seeds of a new order. And the observer, who had moved unseen through the shadows, became the catalyst. Not through violence, not through loud rebellion, but through the slow, relentless illumination of truth. This is the knowledge the powerful hide, the history they obscure, mechanics they disguise with euphemisms and ledger entries. They fear it because once understood, it cannot be undone. The mind that sees clearly begins to see patterns everywhere in institutions, in relationships, in society itself. And the same principles that toppled illusions in Hateville centuries ago still apply today. So remember this: the unseen governs more than the visible. The quiet, patient observer has always held the ultimate leverage. The structures that claim authority exist only by agreement, compliance, and collective denial. Break the agreement in your mind, and you begin to reclaim freedom the system never intended to grant. And now, as this descent ends, consider your own world. What systems shape your thoughts, your actions, your obedience? Which truths have been hidden from you, not because they are complicated, but because they are dangerous to those who benefit from your silence? You have glimpsed the machinery. You have seen the unseen. From this moment on, you are no longer merely a spectator. You are awake. You are aware. And in that awareness lies your power.